Hey guys, welcome to the Aftershow for our discussion analyzing arguments against God, how to think about these. And I think in the live chat we have, let me see how many people we have. We have, actually, it's going to take a second to pull it up here. Because it doesn't show me on the, okay, so we have 4 people. Okay, awesome.
Cool.
Which is really cool because like I was mentioning in the previous video, what makes it really cool is that we can really get down in the nitty gritty, and it's really personable. It's just really awesome. I really really love these. So we have one question already, and we're gonna get to the article in a second. But this one is from Iden Peterson, and he gave one of the objections in the previous one. And he says, for Josh, hey man, what is your view of the laws of nature? Are they
Mm.
descriptions? And do you think that brute facts are even possible? These were discussed a little bit in the Oppie phaser discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about that because I saw that discussion.
Yeah,
So,
and so like let me
yeah,
just jump in here real quick too. So
yeah.
like to me it seems completely obviously true that there has to be at least one brute fact.
Well, I mean, unless the explanation for its existence is its necessity. I can never
Yeah.
really figure out if I think that its necessity removes a reason for its needing an explanation or if it is its explanation.
Yeah, well
You
apart
know what
from
I mean?
like whatever we mean by brute fact, there
Yeah.
still has to be some kind of fact of the matter about the all all reality can't have an outside explanation.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
that
An
there's
outside,
no getting away
external.
from that. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that's what I think about a lot when I think about
Yeah.
brute facts and how I have to sort of accept that there's at least one brute fact in the sense
That is
depending on what you
foundational.
mean.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like how you say that because it does help to kind of direct us to that deeper question, which is what would be the nature of the foundation? Not like whether there is a foundational reality, but what is its nature?
Yeah.
And
There
in the
is some
yeah,
unexplained in the sense of when we're talking about explanation, there like if explanation means outside explanation, you got to have something outside of the thing to cause it.
some other
Then
being or substance. Yeah,
there can't be something outside of all reality, which is this is the deductive not the deductive argument, but one of
the
the arguments
puzzle
that you
path.
get, the puzzle
Yeah,
path.
yeah,
The puzzle path. This is your puzzle path. And now that like it actually took me a second to understand how it was a puzzle, and it is a puzzle. It's a real big puzzle, and I like that you offer it as a puzzle because it gets people thinking on their own.
yeah.
But
I mean, it's yeah, it is a puzzle that like wakes me up in the night. I'm like, how is it that there's anything? This is ridiculous. There should just be nothing, but there's something.
yeah, and what's funny is
And
that you
yeah.
always offer the explanation that there's nothing. Like you usually talk about that too because that seems like a pretty, I mean, it's really simple, it,
Yeah,
but then
that's
it's
one of
just
the
complete.
options,
But
right?
then it's completely absurd.
Yeah, well, it seems false to me, but I like to have an open mind.
All right. Well,
Um,
let me read the question
laws.
again.
So laws, yeah.
Let me
So
read the whole thing again, real
I
quick, just
go
so
ahead.
you have
Yeah,
it. Hey, man, what is your views of the law of nature? Are they descriptions? Let's do that first, and then we'll go to the brute
yeah. I
facts.
just want to say I have no problem with laws being descriptions, but the question then is, what are they describing? Okay, what are they descriptions of? And I remember in graduate school, I was talking with Planning about this because he had a view of laws where he was suggesting that somehow they were kind of anchored in the mind of God or something else. And I remember saying, well, why couldn't they be just reflecting the natures of things? This is exactly what Oppie was saying in the beginning, that they sort of reflect the sort of inner natures of things. But then as I was thinking about that more, it's like, well, what is this nature that laws are describing? I mean, like, so think about gravity. So there's these objects, and then they are moved together. They have a mass F equals, some constant g times the mass of the one times the mass of the other divided by was it r squared, the distance between them. Um, so they have a nature that sort of makes that law true, but it's almost like saying they have a propositional nature. They have a nature of being such that, and then you have the propositional thing, that the law, such that if there's this thing and that thing, then they're attracted. And what's a propositional nature? I mean, propositions have the sort of structure of a thought because there's the proposition that these things have a nature such that they'll attract in this precise way describable by the formula. And then there's the thought that they have that nature. And so many philosophers, they they think that propositions have a kind of what's called an aboutness or an intentional quality where they're about something. And aboutness is also, again, the mark of a thought. So more recently, I've been just thinking that it seems like even if you think that laws reflect natures, they reflect sort of a propositional aspect of natures, which themselves, propositions themselves, have the mark of aboutness, which is the mark of a thought. And this is maybe going into more detail than I need to, but I've more recently been thinking that the best account of laws is going to be in terms of a thought-like structure in the foundation's nature, or in its thinking. So then I could distinguish between two kinds of thought-like natures. There's the necessary ones, which encode laws of logic, and then the contingent ones, which encode the laws of physics. And they're contingent because the idea is the foundation could have created a different universe with different particles with different natures, that would follow different sort of rules of reality. So that would be my general current hypothesis, working hypothesis, as I think about this. Um, but whatever you said,
I need to say something about that.
yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
So there's the question of intentionality, right? Or the argument
Yes,
from intentionality
yeah,
is an argument that Craig gives for the yeah, he gives it for the existence of God too in his debate with Rosenberg. But I've been thinking more about that argument, and one of the responses I think that you could give to it is that, okay, let's assume that you can't have an account of intentionality on from like natural things, like an atom can't be about something else. But then what is it about immaterial things that can be about something else? It seems like we're not getting out of the puzzle at all. Like the puzzle still remains even for immaterial things. Like what is it about the nature of an immaterial substance that
yeah.
grants it the power to be about something else?
I'm really glad that you brought that up because I think that there's a kind of terminology here, material, immaterial, that personally I find to be somewhat distracting from sort of seeing what is the ultimate nature of things. So for me, it's not about whether it's material or immaterial, it's about whether it's fundamentally mental. And why I think that aboutness points to a mind. Well, it's because the things that have aboutness are the things that we're familiar with in our own minds.
Thoughts. Yeah.
Thoughts,
Yeah.
yeah. And so whether that's material or immaterial is almost like beside the point. So the argument isn't that it has to be. The argument I'm making here is not that it has to be immaterial because a
It's
material
thought
thing
like.
couldn't have that. It's that it has to be mental. Yeah, or at least that it's evidence for its being mental.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I guess I was just expanding it further. Well, talking about something sort of related, which is
yeah,
this is usually an argument for like a soul, or it's an argument for God's existence. And I guess I was just pointing out that it seems like we still have that puzzle, regardless of whatever we're talking about. And
yeah,
I think that's kind of overlooked in these
yeah,
discussions is that we're not thinking about like, yeah, obviously natural things aren't about other things. An atom is not about something else. But then it also the puzzle still seems to me applies to immaterial things.
yes. This is a really nice point. There was a conversation that Alvin Plantinga and Peter Van Wagen had in one of my graduate courses, and they just like were in the class talking about this. Or maybe it was a colloquium. I don't remember, but
That had to have been
it did.
interesting.
Yeah, but it was exactly what you're talking about, Cameron, and it was about like whether immaterialism would help. So it's like,
Yeah.
how could a material thing think? Okay, but how could an immaterial thing think? Does immaterialism help? And so Peter was making the argument, if I recall correctly, that if immaterialism doesn't really help, and then Plantinga was arguing why there's a problem there for materialism, but then on immaterialism, you don't have that same problem. And so they kind of went back and forth. So that, yeah, that was interesting.
Okay, well, let's move on. Let me see if there's any other questions that we have yet. It seems like they're mainly talking about the phaser,
But I want to
the
say
Oppian phaser. Yeah.
something else, something about that brute fact because
Oh yeah, we didn't
here,
talk about the brute fact part.
so Phaser and Oppie, they actually agreed on so much. A lot of it I thought was a matter of translation. So it sort of looked like a lot of disagreement, but there were a lot of it was Phaser was like, okay, well, that's not really essential to my argument. And then Graham was like, okay, well, I can follow that. And at the end of the day, they both actually think that there is this kind of ultimate reality that has a special kind of existence that's metaphysically necessary.
Yeah.
And that's a significant point of unity, right? And their conversation didn't continue into the stage two to sort of unpack, well, what kind of a reality this would be.
You know
But
what's interesting is
yeah,
that Graham emailed me I think he either it was either through email or it was right before the discussion where he was telling me that he didn't want to discuss that at all.
Discuss what?
He didn't want to discuss stage two.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he wanted to talk about just stage one, the proofs.
Yeah, focus on stage one. Yeah,
Yeah,
but it's interesting how much overlap they end up having there.
yeah.
And
Well, so
yeah,
let me do this. Let me let you guys know. I know that there's still only 4 people here with us, which is totally cool. Save your questions because let's go ahead and get into the article. Let's get to the Lincoln article. Once we get that out of the way, then we can turn back over to questions, or just hanging out. But because otherwise we're never going to talk about it. Otherwise, it's just going to be sitting here.
just one thought, real quick. So if we're talking about brute contingencies, okay, that's different than brute facts, right? And so the idea is that if the foundation has a necessary existence, that's going to separate it from other kinds of things that are contingent. And the idea is that universal experience and reason are two lights that both point to the same direction, that contingencies alike have a deeper explanation. And so to avoid circularity, that deeper explanation is going to ultimately be a necessary foundation. And yeah, again, both Phaser and Oppie follow lines to that conclusion, maybe different lines, but yeah, so that's a good question.
Okay, so let's turn to the article. So in the article, he talks about his Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. He talks about that as evidence that the universe had a beginning. But then he turns to what a section called God's proof. Oh, and if you need the link to the article, it's in the description of the video, and this is going to be available to anyone who's watching later on as well. The link to the article from Alexander Vilenkin, just go look for it. It's real easy to find. But then he talks about the Kalam cosmological argument. He doesn't call it the Kalam. He just says the cosmological argument for the existence of God consists of 2 parts. And yeah, so even he recognizes that there's a stage 1 and a stage 2 case, which I thought was really cool. Like, this physicist understands that there's a stage 1 and stage 2, which kind of online atheists in a lot of ways miss this distinction between stage 1 and stage 2, and in a lot of ways even act like there is no stage 2 or doesn't exist, or it's just automatically bad. But anyways, I think that it was really cool that he recognized this. But then, so what he does is he agrees with the second premise, and he takes issue with the first part of the argument, where he basically argues that it's not true that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And you already did like a little analysis of this in our email exchange. So do you want to just take it from there?
Yeah, so I thought what I could do is I'm going to pose a challenge to our listeners. So I'm going to read a little bit of his objection, and then the challenge is, using the tools, what kind of an objection is this? Okay, what kind of an objection is this?
I've kind of spoiled it.
You've already kind of said it.
It's against one.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
against
Well,
one.
is it undercutting or rebutting? I guess. Okay.
There you
All
go.
right. So,
Yeah,
so
I haven't done that.
So here's the line. He says, "Modern physics can describe the emergence of the universe as a physical process that does not require a cause." Okay. And later he says there's, let's see, trying to find. Later he says something about there's no reason. There it is. There's no reason why the atom decayed at this moment and not another. Okay. So maybe I should just focus on that first quote because, so modern physics can describe the emergence of the universe as a physical process that does not require a cause. All right. So the argument is completely undone. There you go. So is that an undercutting defeater or rebutting defeater? Because that would be the challenge.
So Iden says undercutting ? And then Maverick Christian, Wade Tisthammer, he's actually been on our show before. He did 2 live discussions actually, which you guys should go check out if you haven't seen those. The first one was on the moral argument, and then the second one was on the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And he even has a paper on the evolutionary argument against naturalism that he submitted. I don't know if it's gone through yet. Give me an update on that, Wade, on where that paper's at. But so he says undercutting as well. So those are the only 2 answers that we have. Both of them think that it's undercutting.
Yeah, that would be my sense as well. So we all seem to have the same sense about that. So it's important to see that, well, if it's undercutting and not rebutting, then to analyze the objection, the right response would be to ask the question, okay, well, is there any good reason to believe that first premise? Even if what he says is true, right? Like, even if it's true that modern physics can describe the emergence of the universe without a cause, is there any reason? I'm going to just read, Cameron, I wrote you a quick email when I was thinking about his article, so I'm just going to read right from my email.
Yeah.
Okay, so he says that, and then he says, if all the conserved numbers of a closed universe are equal to zero, then there is nothing to prevent such a universe from being spontaneously created out of nothing. Okay, there is nothing. Now, here, we really have to make a distinction between not seeing something and seeing that there's nothing. Because he said there is nothing. He says if all conserved numbers of a closed universe are zero, then there's nothing to prevent such a universe from being spontaneously created out of nothing. So here's what I think he means. It's that he isn't finding evidence for this principle from the accepted physical laws. But it does not follow that there are no good reasons to accept that first premise, such as from a general principle of sufficient reason. He hasn't even shown that that premise lacks empirical support. In fact, our universal experience with the causal order is itself successfully predicted by the causal premise, and that itself is a very powerful reason in support of the premise. No simpler competing principle explains that same data. And that's true even if, as Vilenkin suggests, that it's also true that one is not predicted by independently established principles of physics. I sort of think of it like if you're a car mechanic and you work on cars, and then this is maybe not the best analogy, but just work with it. So somebody proposes that there are cheeseburgers, and you go look to see if there are any cheeseburgers in your shop, and you don't find any cheeseburgers, so you say, well, it is now known that there are no cheeseburgers in my shop. Right? Well, does it follow that there are no cheeseburgers, or that there's no evidence for cheeseburgers, that nobody sees any cheeseburgers? Well, that doesn't follow. Like, so just because we don't have in physics a principle that rules out that rules out uncaused existence, it doesn't follow that we don't have any good reason to think that something could come from nothing. And I would say that actually the empirical evidence and some of the arguments we considered earlier are independent reasons for that causal principle.
Yeah. So one of the examples that Dr. Fazer gives is the metal detector analogy, which is say like, yeah, so you have this metal detector. It's really good at detecting metal, and you go out on the beach and you do the metal detector. You don't find any metal, but that doesn't entail that there's nothing out there, right? There could be some plastic that the metal detector couldn't pick up, and so it doesn't follow from the fact that your metal detector didn't detect any metal. It doesn't follow from that there's nothing out there.
Yeah, I like that. That's a better analogy than my cheeseburger analogy.
It works. It's the same thing, but it's
same
just
thing.
It's something that Fazer had. So
yeah, and I always want to read this next part because it's about authority, and I think this is really about how ideas flow and sometimes get blocked. So I'm just going to read this. I suspect that for the vast majority of people, the influence of Vilenkin's statements will have is based on his authority as a scientist and a good scientist, and not based on their own firsthand sight of the success or failure of the argument. For this reason, it is often helpful dialectically to respond by citing other authorities, like what other experts in causation, like the philosophers of causation, like what do they think? But I personally don't like doing that because I want to empower people to see things for themselves. That's the only way they'll have the power to resist being swept along by the winds of expert opinion. Yeah, so he says, we have no way to begin to address this mystery. That's what he says. We have no way. That word we conveys a kind of authority. We have no way to begin this mystery. Yet he doesn't address the ways proposed that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. But what he means, I take it, is that there is no way to address this mystery purely with the tools that he's working with in his field. And that might be true. So it's like the metal detector. But there are other tools.
yeah. Did you have anything else to add there?
Well, just that, I mean,
in response to his article, because otherwise we can just move on to questions.
yeah, no, I mean, just that, I mean, I think that there's extremely powerful evidence for that first premise based on universal experience and reason. I mean, if something just exists, but its non-existence is a real possibility, then it makes sense to wonder, okay, what explains its existence? What's the best explanation of its existence? I mean, in general, the best explanation is going to be more probable than no explanation. If that weren't true, then how could you even think that it was more probable than not that your current thoughts aren't just in you, and all your memories aren't just in you with no explanation. Well, the best explanation is more probable than no explanation. And if that's right, I mean, that's an independent reason to think that if there is a beginning of material things, that the best explanation of that beginning is going to be more probable than no explanation. And so, well, what would be the best explanation of a beginning? Well, it's not going to be nothing, because that's not a thing. That's not an explanation. Um, so that would be sort of one reason that is, to consider.
Yeah, one of the strongest reasons in my mind for the truth of the first premise, other than like the fact that it's just ubiquitous throughout our experience of everyday life, is the fact that, well, it goes back to your book with Proust on necessary existence, and we talked about it in our 4-part series on the contingency argument, but it's about like the fact that it will take the set of things that can come into being without an explanation. If it's not empty, or yeah, if it's empty, then premise 1 is true. But if it's not empty, then how many things are in there, right? And you can have some kind of theory about what number of things are in there. But it seems the
There's
least
seven things that
yeah,
come
but
exist
all
from
of it, yeah,
nothing, and
all
they're
of them
all
are gonna,
blue. They're all blue.
but it's all gonna be arbitrary. It seems to me like if you select something that like, it seems if you're gonna say there's at least one member in there, you're gonna have to say, unless you just want to be arbitrary, you have to say that there's an infinite number of things in that set. The reason why that's important is because we then talk about the fact that like, what's the probability that one of those things pops in front, it pops in your vision right now? What's the probability that that happens if the set is not empty? This is getting kind of abstract. Maybe there's a better way of putting this, but essentially, like, I guess the way that I think of it is like, if there is this set of things that could come into being without an explanation or a cause, and if it's not empty, then most likely it's infinite, because there's no other, you can't put a limit on that non-arbitrarily. But if that's the case, then things should be popping into being all the time.
Yeah, and differences in place and time are also just not relevant differences, unless you have some reason, independent reason,
But and
to think
also if
that
it's
there's a relevant difference.
yeah, and also yeah, if it's infinite, then things should be happening all the time because it's
Yeah.
infinite. And so that, like, and the fact that that doesn't happen is just really good evidence that that set is empty. Like it's very, very, very good evidence. I can't think of a way out of that at all.
Yeah, I mean, and I would even say every single scientific experiment reconfirms the causal order. So, I mean, in a way, I mean, you talk about sort of laws of physics being supported by science, but every single experiment that would support a law of physics would reconfirm this general principle of causal order. And so, I mean, that's a lot of evidence. And I mean, that's in addition, or sort of another way of thinking about it, to the argument you just gave from how would you cut off the set of things that could come to be from nothing. If that's not an empty set, how many things are in that set, and what keeps them all from sort of flooding into your visual field
Yeah, yeah,
randomly at any moment? Yeah, and then there's just the arbitrary differences between one thing and another. If one thing can come from nothing, then what makes that relevantly different from your current thoughts and beliefs? And you think, well, those came from something. I know they did. Well, how do you know that? I mean, and you do know that, but then if you do know that, then what makes those states of reality relevantly different from other states of reality? And look, I say if you have a reason to think that there is a relevant difference, so that some things can come from nothing and others can't, then that reason can make a difference in your thinking about the principle. But without that reason, and I'm not aware of any good reason, the extrapolation is reasonable. So you extrapolate from your experiences, and the general principle is the simplest principle then that would explain those experiences. So that would be sort of one analysis of that premise. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking for questions now.
So
Let
just to
me.
say, the other objection that he raises is a rebutting defeater, where he says he suggests from quantum physics. I'm trying to find the quote, but the basic idea is that you don't have a deterministic cause. See, what does he say? The decay. There's no reason why the atom decayed at this particular moment and not
Yeah,
at
I'm
other.
really puzzled
Yeah.
at why people think that this is a good argument against the
I think
principle.
I think this is why Cameron. I think it's because there are many different arguments and they're sort of clustered together. And one of them appeals to this principle of sufficient reason. And one way of interpreting sufficient there is completely entailing or determining its effect.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a right response or type of objection that would target that argument. And so I think that what the problem is there's just too many arguments, and we need to slow things down and separate some things and say, okay, the Kalam argument isn't that one. We're not appealing to the principle that the cause necessitates its effect. It might just be a prior condition for it, or be a probabilistic condition for it. So, yeah.
Yeah, can we unpack that a little bit more? I'm following, but I think for anyone who watches this either now or in the future, it might help to sort of lay that out. So when we're thinking about premise one again, everything that begins to exist has a cause. What the target there is to say that, like, well, with virtual particles, especially on this one interpretation of quantum mechanics, where we're talking about like indeterminism, or this is going to be an indeterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics, where virtual particles begin to exist for no reason. Where that's targeting an interpretation of the first premise where cause is meant to be something that happens like with 100% certainty, right? When A causes B, A must cause B, right?
Without any other possibility.
Without any
Yeah.
other possibility.
Yeah. Think of like dominoes knocking each other down. And as long as it's set up right, each domino will get knocked down. And the dominoes can't like make a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is that that's not necessarily what's going on in premise one,
Right.
right? We can have these kind of probabilistic causes. Do you have an example of something like that?
Yeah. So in my book, I talk about the gumball machine where let's say there's, I don't know, red and blue gumballs, and you put in a quarter, and it's determined from that quarter that a gumball is going to come out, but it's not determined like which color is going to come out. Now, maybe technically like it actually is, but you just like don't know, right? Because the laws of physics are at work and there is only one outcome at that macro scale. But let's just assume that it's tied to quantum mechanics and it really isn't
And it is,
determined.
and it's probabilistic. Yeah.
It's just probabilistic. Like let's just say it's 50% you get the blue one, 50% you get the red one. And if somebody says, "Well, what explains why I got the blue one rather than the red one?" Well, there's no contrastive explanation there that would explain why you got the one rather than the other. All you have is you put the quarter in, and that's why you got a gumball. And
But
if you
that doesn't
hadn't,
mean that there's no cause.
yeah, and here's the point: if you hadn't put the quarter in, you wouldn't have gotten a gumball at all. And so the idea is like if there isn't a prior condition that allows for the effect, that effect just doesn't happen. So for example, like imagine a blue cube, okay, that could come to be. Unless the condition for that blue cube coming to be is in place. I don't mean a sufficient condition. I mean some kind of necessary condition is in place. That blue cube just won't come into place. That's why you can't just like lie in bed and like hope that your favorite technology sort of appears in front of your eyes. I mean, you could hope for that, but your hope will never be satisfied unless the conditions for its existence are in place. And so that doesn't contradict anything in science. I mean, that fits that indeterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics nicely.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that discussion just now. All right, let's move on to a question from Barry Anderberg. He says, are there any fully developed atheistic accounts of necessary existence that try to account for why contingent reality exists and why it is how it is?
Yeah, I love that question. So the first time I ever saw a non-theistic account of necessary existence was from Quentin Smith. And he's got this article where he talks about the advantage of having a cause of the universe, or at least the contingent part of the universe, in terms of some kind of necessary initial something. This is like Graham Oppy's view. So he says it's like a point, it's
Yeah.
like space-time point or something. And
Well,
so
so
the
let me
advantage,
point out that this
yes.
this is granting stage one, and now we're talking about stage two of the argument from contingency.
Yeah. Now, is it fully worked out? I mean, so I want to make a distinction here that I think is very helpful for analyzing this non-theistic proposal. It's the distinction between an account that precludes theism and an account that just is incomplete. So an account that would preclude theism would be something like this. There's a first cause, it has necessary existence, and it has some kind of arbitrary limits built into it. Okay. Well, that would sort of preclude theism because, as I'm understanding theism, theism entails that the first cause is not arbitrarily limited, but is supreme. So if we add to our account, we add this sort of complexity to our account, that's going to preclude theism. But if we want to simplify our account and shave off those arbitrary boundaries, I mean, in a way, this is what Smith does. I remember reading this. I was like, Smith, you're right on the right track because you've got this simple space-time point, and he doesn't add the arbitrary complexity to it. In a way, I would say his view, as far as he spells it out, I mean, maybe the wording is weird if he calls it a space-time point, because what could that be? But um, but he doesn't build in anything to the theory that I think would preclude that it is actually a supreme being. And I was actually thinking that that would simplify his view because, well,
That's really
if,
interesting.
if you don't say anything, then you're sort of safe. You're not sticking your neck out. You're not saying
Yeah.
that it's has arbitrary limits or that it's simply supreme. In a way, I think that's kind of what Oppie is doing. It's like, okay, I'm not going to fill that in either direction, but it's either one or the other.
In your
Yeah.
exchange with him, did you point that out?
I think that we were using those tools, and I don't remember really how that particular thing came out. I remember reflecting on it because I remember he was initially saying, "Well, I'm not thinking about this the way you are, Josh," and I was surprised because it seemed like actually we were thinking about it the same way. Like I was using his tools, which are also my tools, and then when I reflect on it later, it seemed like my analysis was that that yeah he hadn't. Well, there's two things. First, that in the initial discussion he hadn't filled in. He's sort of leaving it open. So sort of intellectual humility
Yeah.
to leave it open. And then second, later in the conversation, some argument that it couldn't be mind-like or have a mind because of some views in the philosophy of mind. And so in a way, it was sort of implicit in our conversation there. But I feel like there's something there that is missed. Someday I'm going to make a video on this because one of the things I think atheists are saying that is good and so helpful, and we talked about this last time actually, is just the value of simplifying your theory and shaving off that arbitrary complexity. And I mean, and that's one of my reasons for being a theist. It's because it allows me to have a simple, unified root that has wide predictive success in many different domains without positing arbitrary complexities. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point that's just kind of missed in the wider dialectic.
Yeah. So walk me through real quick because we have some time, and we have one more question. What's really is a set of questions from Iden Peterson, but I think that's the last question that we have, unless you guys want to ask more, which I'm totally cool with. But walk me through your reasons again, going back to your exchange with Jump. Walk me through your reasons for rejecting his account of simplicity, which was basically the opposite, which was to say that you only posit something that is powerful enough to
Yeah,
explain what needs to be explained.
yeah,
And
and
that in his view is a lot simpler.
well, and to be honest, I couldn't figure out whether his view of simplicity was necessarily different or whether it was had to do with the application or sort of the teasing out of its implications. But first, I just want to affirm that if you say less, then you're going to be less likely to be wrong. So there is a kind of intellectual humility to saying, like, I just don't really know sort of the nature of ultimate reality. I'm not going to say what it is. Okay. So I want to affirm that. And I think that was kind of, I think, his main point there, as far as I remember it or understood it. Um, but what I think a lot of people miss is that we can then go on to think about, okay, well, what are the options? And we can begin to think about which option is most probable. And even though I think there are other arguments for going past probability, just start with probability. And I think other things being equal, the simplest account of the nature of the foundation is going to be more probable than adding additional components to your theory that spell out different parts and pieces of the foundation. I mean, you might think, like, for example, you might think that necessary reality includes the laws of logic. There's a kind of necessity to them, a kind of a permanence to them. You might think it also includes this sort of moral landscape, and that some aspects of that moral landscape are necessary. There's a kind of moral Platonist view. And you might think with Api, that it has a necessary sort of concrete existence as well. And so there's all these different like pieces of the necessary reality, but what unifies them? Like, what's the simplest account of them? And so if we have a nature that's fundamentally supreme or perfect, then we can independently successfully predict these different pieces, because if it's perfect, it's going to have the perfect principles of reason, which is another way of describing logic. It's perfect reasoning. It's the laws of thought. You've got the perfect moral standard that's going to be predicted from this perfect anchor, this perfect foundation. You're also going to get the powers, perfect powers, to produce a world in which beings can then discover the principles of logic, the principles of right and wrong. And so this gives us a simpler route. I mean, this is the same reasoning that scientists use and physicists use when they're looking at the sort of deeper explanations of physical reality. We have sort of in biology, we've got different organisms and they have some DNA in common. So what explains that? So we have an account
Mm-hmm.
of the biological history, right? You could just say, well, there's all these different organisms and that's it. Just sort of leave it unexplained. But that deeper, simpler route is something that's going to have predictive success. And that's a reason to believe it. It's a reason to think it's true. And so in the same way, and also physicists are looking for simpler laws that explain, this sort of unified theory of reality that can explain these other observations. And so I'm just using that exact same principle. And when I say I'm using that, I mean, this is something that philosophers and theorists of the origin of reality are thinking about and using. And we can apply this. And what this gives us is a model of the foundation that then simplifies and unifies many different parts of reality with a simple root. And again, I just want to emphasize, I mean, that this is, I think, what a lot of non-theists are wanting. This is what they're saying is sort of a problem in their eyes with various posits from various corners of religion. And they're saying we should sort of eliminate, simplify our ontology. And that's like, we can celebrate that point of unity. It's like, yes, that's right. So let's do that. Let's figure out what's the simplest, most unified account of ultimate reality that best explains all the different pieces. So yeah, there's, I don't know if that was a sermon or what that was, but
No, it was good. It was good. Okay, so Aiden Peterson, he has a two-parter, and sorry, I don't know if I've been pronouncing that wrong, but he just corrected me, so I'll get it correct from here on out. Aiden. Uh, so he says, what do you think about Keith Ward's critique of the Trinity and Swinburne's rejection of God's necessity?
I'm
Two-parter.
not. I mean, yeah. So I'm not actually familiar. I mean, I know Keith Ward. So how does his critique go?
Maybe,
Or send me a link.
yeah, Aiden, if you want to put that in the live chat, or just we could send him a link and we can talk about it later. But I know you have a lot to say about Swinburne's rejection of God's necessity.
Yeah. So we talked about that last time, and I almost just want to take that section from our conversation last time and just replay it here. I've had some really cool conversations with Richard about his objection. I have a published response to it. Um, I think it probably is just the most useful to put a link to my published response, because that articulates, I think, the root of what's going on there. But basically, what Richard, he's sort of echoing Hume. So Hume has a conceivability worry. We can conceive of a world in which
Let me actually look for it
there's
while you're talking about it. What is it called?
I think it's could God fail to exist? And then it's also, we discuss it, Proust and I discuss it in our book, Necessary Existence. We talk about Richard's objection. And
Okay, I've got it.
yeah, so there's a kind of conceivability worry. And Richard develops it in more technical detail. But the basic idea is that it looks like it should be logically possible for there to be an empty world. But if that's right, then how could there be a being that has necessary existence that spans all the worlds? Um, and one of the points that Proust and I make is that there's a kind of parity problem that if it's logically possible for there to be an empty world, it's equally logically possible that it is sort of self-consistent for there to be an explanation of contingent things. And then that explanation would itself be a non-contingent thing. But then if there could be a non-contingent thing, then by standard inferences and modal logic, there couldn't be an empty world. So you kind of have this sort of parity. It's like the ontological argument. One of the weaknesses of the ontological argument is there's this reverse ontological argument. So if it's possible that there's a maximally great being, well, it's possible that there is no maximally great being, and but those possibilities are incompatible. And sort of in the same way, if it's possible that there's no necessary being, well, it's equally possible that there is a necessary foundation or necessary being, according to a certain account of possibility. Now, if you widen your account, that's going to change the game. And then the other thing that I pointed out was just when you think about the logic of logic itself, there is this argument that logic itself has a necessity, and and that necessity entails its necessary existence. And that's in my article, From Necessary Truth to Necessary Existence. And that was one where when Richard and I were talking about the premises in that argument, he actually accepted the premises in that argument until he saw that it contradicted his argument. And so then he went back. It was kind of a fun conversation because he went back and said, okay, well, now I'm going to reject this axiom. So it was productive. It was a fair move. But yeah, so I probably just go to the links because
Yeah, I put
it's
the link.
very hard to, yeah.
Yeah, to summarize it. To summarize it all down in yeah. So I put
I
it in the
find it
live
very
chat.
challenging because it's an important objection and there's lots of concepts in play. And I
Yeah.
find it really hard to just externalize. I really want to get it clear when I say something. And sometimes the best way is just look at the article that lays it out. Yeah.
I put it in the live chat, and I also appended it to the description of this video. So anyone who's watching in the future, or if you're in the live chat right now, just refresh the page, and you'll see the link to the description, or to the you'll see the link to. It's getting late here. You'll see the link to the paper in the description. There you go. Okay, so we have one last question, and then we'll close it out. This one is from J.R. Byron. He says, can the nature of the atheistic necessary being that involves indeterminate causes be timeless if the change creating the universe was due to its nature instead of a choice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's something I've thought about. One of my early presentations was on this. It's a really good question. And it really is about how, so one way you could think about the connection between the cause, the ultimate cause, and then the effect is that it's either governed by its nature or it's governed by some kind of a choice. And you might think like if it's governed by its nature, then the effect has to really reflect the nature of the cause. So if the cause has necessary existence, the effect has to have necessary existence. If the cause is timeless, the effect has to be timeless. Um, but then you might think, well, but there is a temporal order. The effect isn't just timeless. Of course, now we can go back to wondering, well, does the cause have to be timeless? Well, if it's the cause of time, but that takes us into the weeds of theories of time. So,
Yeah,
but yeah, no, it's a really good. I mean, this is one of those that I've like taken long walks thinking about this one, and I
maybe
don't really
the
have. Yeah, go
yeah. So
ahead.
maybe the way of thinking about this is that, like, well, let's just stipulate that the universe is 14 billion years old. Okay, and in the nature, like, part of its nature is that it'll create a universe that is 14 billion years old, or something along those lines. Does that even seem coherent to you? I realize that this increases the
Yeah.
complexity of the thing.
Well, and Wes Morrison talks about this kind of thing. Like it could just sort of have this nature of indeterministically producing its effect in time. And I remember talking with Bill Craig about this. This was like after a class, and I was just like talking with him about this possibility that you'd have just this sort of static, timeless cause that just produces its effect. And I remember he just looked at me and he's like, well, it's like he was being very honest. He's like, it just seems to me, Josh, that you can't have state event causation. So something like, I'm probably misstating how he put it exactly, but you can't go from like just a static state to a temporal effect. Like that type of causation is just impossible, at least without some kind of personal volition. And yeah, and this, I think this was sort of the beginning of me taking these long walks, trying to like think about that. And I guess to be honest, I haven't really come to any clarity about it. I just see sort of a lot of different thoughts myself, which isn't to say that you couldn't have clarity about it, just to say that it's still kind of an open question for me.
Cool. All
Yeah.
right, we'll leave it at that. Do you have any other thoughts before we close it out?
Thank you guys. This is a lot of fun. And oh yeah, actually, my last note about me saying it's still an open question. It's almost like I had to realize that, yeah, it's really powerful to be able to realize when you just don't know, and just to say that. But it's sometimes hard to do. Um, and I just almost want to even encourage people as they're thinking through these things to almost delight in the exploration and just realizing that there's always more to know and discover. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about this kind of inquiry, and in this, I think this does open up the gates for insights to flow to each other, is when people have that kind of humility. Yeah. So anyway, I'm
Yeah.
not trying to say I'm humble or whatever. I'm just thankful for this time, and I realize I just don't always know. So
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll schedule something. The 2 points that we talked about in email, like maybe we'll schedule something later on in the future on the second point about how to, you know, have better conversations between theists and atheists. I think that'd be a good idea to do.
sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks guys for watching. Thank you all to all the patrons. Like I said, it's getting late here, so like my brain is like kind of turning to mud. But I appreciate all of you a lot. It really means a lot that you guys are supporting our work and supporting me personally. It's like it's a really big deal. So I really appreciate it. You guys have a good night wherever you are, and if you're watching this in the future, you're still awesome. Doesn't matter that you weren't here tonight. So all right, and we'll see you guys later.